The morning sun filtered through the dusty blinds of Maria's small apartment on the outskirts of Denver. She stood in front of her closet, contemplating what to wear for her flight. Nothing too flashy, she decided, pulling out a simple navy blue blouse and comfortable gray slacks. At 64, Maria Alvarez had long ago stopped trying to impress anyone. These days, comfort was her priority. She packed light, a single carry-on with just enough clothes for 3 days in Washington, D.C. The invitation letter sat on her kitchen table, its official seal gleaming under the light. Maria had almost thrown it away when it first arrived. These ceremonies, these reminders of the past, they weren't really her style. But her daughter had insisted. "Mom, they don't give the Distinguished Service Medal to just anyone," Anna had said during their weekly phone call. "You earned this. You should be there." Maria sighed as she folded the letter and tucked it into her purse. Perhaps Anna was right. Some parts of the past were worth remembering, even the difficult ones. The taxi ride to Denver International Airport was quiet. The driver tried to make small talk, but Maria responded with polite but brief answers. Her mind was elsewhere, floating between memories of cockpits and control rooms, of split-second decisions made miles above the Earth's surface. The airport buzzed with the usual activity, families dragging oversized luggage, business people walking briskly while talking on phones, airport staff directing the flow of humanity through security checkpoints. Maria moved through it all like a ghost, unnoticed and unbothered, just how she liked it. Security was a breeze. The TSA agent barely glanced at her ID before waving her through. Maria couldn't help but smile a little. 20 years ago, she had helped develop some of the security protocols these agents now followed. If only they knew. Gate 34 was crowded when she arrived. Flight 1782 to Washington, D.C. was scheduled to depart in 45 minutes, and most seats in the waiting area were already taken. Maria found a spot against the wall and pulled out her paperback novel, an old thriller she'd read at least 3 times before. The familiar story was comforting, like visiting an old friend. Now boarding Flight 1782 to Washington, D.C., starting with our military personnel and passengers needing special assistance, the gate agent announced. Maria stayed seated. Despite qualifying for early boarding on both counts, she preferred to wait. Let the rushed and the worried go first. The plane wouldn't leave without her. When most passengers had boarded, Maria finally stood, gathered her things, and made her way to the gate. The young agent smiled as she scanned Maria's boarding pass. "Seat 12F, window seat," the agent said. "Enjoy your flight, ma'am." Maria nodded her thanks and walked down the jetway. At the aircraft door, a flight attendant with a bright smile and Diane on her name tag greeted her. "Welcome aboard. Right this way." The Boeing 737 was nearly full. Maria squeezed past knees and bags in the narrow aisle until she reached row 12. A businessman in a crisp suit occupied the aisle seat, and a college-aged girl with headphones sat in the middle. They both stood to let Maria through to her window seat. "Thank you," she murmured, settling in and stowing her small bag under the seat in front of her. The businessman immediately returned to his laptop, while the girl bobbed her head to whatever music was playing through her headphones. Maria turned her attention to the window. Ground crew scurried around on the tarmac below, a choreographed dance she had watched hundreds of times before, though usually from a different perspective. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Good morning, folks. This is Captain Reynolds speaking. We're looking at clear skies all the way to D.C. today, with an estimated flight time of 3 hours and 20 minutes. We're just waiting on final clearance from the tower, and we'll be on our way shortly." Maria leaned back in her seat. The familiar pre-flight announcements washed over her as she gazed out at the Rocky Mountains in the distance. How different this was from her days in the cockpit, where she was the one making announcements, running through checklists, feeling the responsibility of every soul on board resting on her shoulders. The plane began to move, slowly at first, then picking up speed as it taxied toward the runway. Maria felt the slight flutter in her stomach that she always got during takeoff. A mixture of excitement and respect for the forces about to come into play. Some things never changed, even after all these years. The engines roared, pushing passengers back into their seats as the aircraft accelerated down the runway. Maria watched as the ground fell away and Denver became a sprawling map beneath them. The plane banked slightly, heading east toward the rising sun and the nation's capital. Once they reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers began to move about the cabin, retrieving items from overhead bins or making their way to the restrooms. The flight attendants started their beverage service, the cart slowly making its way up the aisle. "Something to drink?" Diane asked when she reached row 12. "Just water, please," Maria replied. The businessman ordered coffee, the girl a ginger ale. Such ordinary interactions on what should have been an ordinary flight. Maria sipped her water and returned to her novel, losing herself in its familiar pages. Beside her, the girl removed her headphones. "First time going to D.C.?" she asked, surprising Maria with the sudden conversation. Maria shook her head. "No, I've been many times. Business or pleasure?" The girl continued, seemingly eager to chat. "A bit of both, I suppose," Maria answered, not wanting to elaborate. "I'm visiting my brother. He works for some congressman," the girl said. "I'm Kelly, by the way." "Nice to meet you, Kelly. I'm Maria." "What do you do, Maria?" "If you don't mind me asking," Maria hesitated. It was a simple question with a complicated answer. "I'm retired now," she said finally. "But I used to work for the government." This was technically true, though it barely scratched the surface. How could she explain to this young woman what it meant to be one of the first female test pilots for experimental aircraft? How could she describe the feeling of pushing a machine to its limits, of dancing on the edge of what was possible while the earth curved beneath you? "Cool," Kelly said, clearly expecting more details that Maria wasn't offering. After a moment of awkward silence, the girl put her headphones back on. Maria returned to her book, but the words blurred before her eyes. The conversation had stirred up memories she usually kept carefully tucked away. Her mind wandered back to her early days in the Air Force, to the skeptical looks from male colleagues, to the countless hours she spent proving herself in simulators and cockpits. Through the window, she watched as they passed over the patchwork landscape of America's heartland, farms and small towns, highways and rivers, all so small from up here, all part of the country she had sworn to protect, a country that was now, decades later, finally acknowledging her contributions. The medal ceremony wasn't until tomorrow afternoon. Maria had booked an extra day to visit the Air and Space Museum. She always made time for it when in D.C., walking through the exhibits like a pilgrim visiting sacred sites. Some of the aircraft on display had her fingerprints on them, literally and figuratively. Not that anyone would know. Her work on certain projects remained classified, hidden behind redacted documents and security clearances. The flight continued smoothly, the plane cutting through clear blue skies. Maria finished a chapter of her book and closed it, feeling tired suddenly. Perhaps she would try to nap for the remainder of the flight. She leaned her head against the window, watching the clouds pass below. As her eyes began to drift closed, the captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds again. Just wanted to let you know that we'll be passing near a military training exercise in about 30 minutes. If you're seated on the right side of the aircraft, you might catch a glimpse of some F-22 Raptors. Nothing to be concerned about. This is a coordinated exercise and we've been cleared to fly through this airspace." Maria's eyes snapped open. F-22 Raptors. Her heart quickened slightly. Of all the aircraft to encounter on this particular journey, it had to be the ones she knew most intimately. The ones that had nearly cost her everything, and ultimately earned her the medal she was about to receive. She closed her book and tucked it into the seat pocket. Suddenly she wasn't tired anymore. As passengers on the right side of the plane began to stir with interest at the captain's announcement, Maria remained still, her face revealing nothing of the memories and emotions stirring beneath the surface. The businessman beside her closed his laptop. "F-22s, huh? That should be something to see. My son has posters of those things all over his bedroom walls." Maria nodded politely but said nothing. What could she say? That she had helped design the emergency protocols for those very aircraft. That she had once pulled a maneuver in an F-22 that was now taught at the Air Force Academy. That her actions in one of those jets had saved lives and changed the course of her career forever. No, those were stories for another time, perhaps. For now she was just another passenger in seat 12F, flying east into a past she thought she had left behind. The steady hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin as passengers settled into the rhythm of the flight. Maria stared out the window, lost in thought. The businessman beside her had returned to his laptop, and Kelly had dozed off, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle. The announcement about the F-22s had stirred something in Maria, memories she'd spent years carefully filing away. "More water, ma'am?" Diane, the flight attendant, appeared at her side. "Pitcher in hand. Yes, thank you." Maria accepted the refill, her hand steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside her. Excited about seeing the fighter jets? Diane asked conversationally as she poured. They're just machines, Maria replied, then immediately regretted her dismissive tone. But impressive ones, she added with a small smile. Diane lingered a moment longer than necessary. My brother's in the Air Force, always talking about those Raptors like they're something magical. They are in their way, Maria admitted. Fifth-generation fighters with capabilities that would have seemed like science fiction when I was younger. The flight attendant gave her a curious look before moving on to the next row. Maria silently chided herself. She needed to be more careful. Today was about blending in, being just another passenger on her way to Washington. The medal ceremony tomorrow was enough of a spotlight. She didn't need any attention before then. Outside her window, the landscape had changed from the flat farmlands of the Midwest to the rolling hills of the Appalachians. They were making good time. Maria checked her watch, just under an hour until they would land at Reagan National. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, breaking into her thoughts. Folks, Captain Reynolds here. We're about to enter the airspace where that military exercise I mentioned earlier is taking place. For those of you on the right side of the aircraft, you might want to take a look out your windows in the next few minutes. The Air Force has informed us that 2 F-22 Raptors will be visible. It's not every day you get to see a $100 million fighter jet up close, so enjoy the view. A ripple of excitement moved through the cabin. Several passengers on the left side unbuckled their seatbelts and craned their necks, hoping for a glimpse. Kelly stirred beside Maria, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Did he say fighter jets? She asked, suddenly alert. Maria nodded. F-22s, cool. Can I look? Kelly pointed at Maria's window. Before Maria could answer, a murmur swept through the right side of the plane as the first passengers caught sight of the approaching aircraft. Maria turned to the window, and there they were, 2 sleek gray Predators slicing through the sky. Their distinctive silhouettes were unmistakable to anyone who knew aircraft. But Maria knew them better than most. The Raptors flew in perfect formation, maintaining a respectful distance from the commercial airliner, while staying close enough to be clearly visible. Their presence was both a courtesy and a demonstration, a reminder of American air superiority casually displayed for civilian appreciation. Wow, Kelly breathed, leaning across Maria to get a better view. They're amazing. Yes, Maria said softly. They are. For a moment, she was transported back to Edwards Air Force Base, to the first time she'd seen an F-22 prototype up close. The awe she'd felt then, the privilege of being one of the few allowed near such a classified project, came rushing back. She remembered running her hand along the composite fuselage, marveling at how something so lethal could also be so beautiful. The businessman had abandoned his work to join in the viewing. Incredible machines, he commented, echoing Maria's thoughts. My company makes some of the communication systems for military aircraft. Not for the F-22 specifically, that's all classified stuff, but similar technology. Maria made a non-committal sound. If only he knew who he was talking to. She had spent countless hours in meetings with contractors just like him, evaluating systems, demanding improvements, insisting on redundancies that would save pilots' lives when primary systems failed. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain's voice returned. The Air Force pilots have radioed that they'll be accompanying us for the next 15 minutes as part of their exercise. They've asked me to extend their greetings to all veterans and active-duty military personnel on board today. Kelly looked at Maria with renewed interest. Are you military? You seem to know about these planes. Maria hesitated. Former Air Force, she admitted. It was the simplest answer, though far from complete. My dad was Army, Kelly said. He always said Air Force people had it easy. Nice bases, better food. She grinned to show she was teasing. We did have better food, Maria acknowledged with a small smile. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. This kind of gentle ribbing between service branches was familiar territory. The Raptors adjusted their position, dropping slightly below the airliner's flight path to give passengers a better view. Maria watched their movements with a professional eye, appreciating the precision, the control. These weren't just pilots showing off. They were demonstrating textbook formation flying. Diane returned to their row, this time with a different expression on her face. She leaned down close to Maria. Ma'am, I hope you don't mind, but I noticed your name on the passenger list. Are you Colonel Maria Alvarez by any chance? Maria stiffened. She hadn't used her rank in years, preferring to leave that part of her life behind. I'm retired now, she said quietly. My brother mentioned a Colonel Alvarez once, said she was a legend in F-22 circles. Diane's voice remained low, respectful of Maria's privacy. There might be more than one Alvarez in the Air Force, Maria deflected, but her expression gave her away. Kelly was listening now, her attention diverted from the jets outside. Wait, you're a colonel? She asked, not bothering to keep her voice down. A passenger across the aisle turned to look. Maria felt the cocoon of anonymity she had carefully wrapped around herself beginning to unravel. I was, a long time ago, she admitted. Diane straightened up, a decision visible in her eyes. Excuse me for a moment, ma'am. Before Maria could stop her, the flight attendant was making her way toward the front of the plane. Maria watched her go with a sinking feeling. So much for traveling incognito. Outside, the F-22s continued their escort. One of the pilots executed a gentle roll, displaying the aircraft's smooth handling capabilities. It was a move Maria had performed hundreds of times, though usually at much higher speeds and altitudes. The businessman was watching her now, his earlier disinterest replaced by curiosity. You flew those? He asked, gesturing toward the window. Among other things, Maria said, keeping her tone neutral. I had no idea we had female F-22 pilots, he said, his surprise evident. Maria bit back a sharp response. Even after all these years, the assumptions grated on her. There are quite a few now, she said instead. Though not when I started. Kelly was practically bouncing in her seat. That's so cool. Were you like a test pilot or something? Something like that, Maria said, unwilling to elaborate further. Her eyes tracked the flight attendant, who was now speaking to the co-pilot at the cockpit door. The co-pilot glanced back toward Maria's row, then nodded and disappeared into the cockpit. Minutes later, Captain Reynolds's voice returned to the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been informed that we have a distinguished passenger with us today. Colonel Maria Alvarez, former director of the F-22 test pilot program, is traveling in seat 12F. The pilots escorting us have asked if she would acknowledge them. A hush fell over the cabin. All eyes turned to Maria, who sat frozen, her face a careful mask. This was exactly what she had hoped to avoid. The attention, the inevitable questions, the weight of her history suddenly thrust back upon her shoulders. The businessman stared at her with newfound respect. Kelly's mouth had fallen open in surprise. Across the aisle, a middle-aged woman with a military bearing, likely a veteran herself, gave Maria a small, understanding nod. Diane returned to Maria's row. I'm sorry if I overstepped, Colonel, she said quietly, but the co-pilot recognized your name immediately. Apparently, you're something of a hero to these guys. I was just doing my job, Maria replied, the words automatic after years of deflecting praise. The captain asks if you'd be willing to acknowledge the escort, Diane continued. No pressure, but they'd consider it an honor. Maria looked out the window at the two F-22s flying alongside them. Somewhere in those cockpits were young pilots, men or women who had grown up with stories of the early days, the test flights, the missions that remained classified even now. They would have trained in simulators programmed with data she had helped collect, would have studied emergency procedures she had developed, often through harrowing first-hand experience. For a moment she was tempted to refuse, to insist on maintaining the privacy she had guarded so carefully. But something about seeing those aircraft, about being so close again to the world she had once belonged to, weakened her resolve. Tell the captain I'd be happy to, she said finally. As Diane hurried back to relay the message, Maria turned to the window once more. The past she had tried to leave behind in Denver was catching up with her, faster than she had anticipated. Tomorrow's ceremony suddenly felt less like an isolated event and more like the beginning of a reckoning with her history. Whether she was ready or not, Colonel Maria Alvarez was stepping back into the light. Diane returned moments later, followed by the co-pilot, a tall man with close-cropped gray hair and the confident bearing of a career aviator. He approached Maria's row and crouched down beside her seat, extending his hand. Colonel Alvarez, I'm First Officer Tom Wilson. It's an honor to have you aboard today. Maria shook his hand, noting the firmness of his grip. Thank you, but please, it's just Maria now. Wilson smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. Once a colonel, always a colonel in my book. I was at Edwards when you were running the test program. Never had the privilege of working with you directly, but everyone knew who you were. Maria felt a flush of embarrassment. She had never been comfortable with recognition, even during her active service days. That was a lifetime ago, she said. For some of us, maybe, Wilson replied. But those Raptor pilots out there? They still study your flight data. The Alvarez recovery maneuver is standard training now. Kelly, who had been listening with undisguised fascination, couldn't contain herself any longer. The what maneuver? You have a maneuver named after you? Wilson glanced at the young woman, then back to Maria. Sorry, am I saying too much? It's fine, Maria assured him, though she wished they were having this conversation in private rather than surrounded by curious passengers. It was just a technique I developed for recovering from a flat spin in the early prototype. Wilson's eyebrows rose. Just a technique, he repeated with a small laugh. Colonel, with all due respect, that technique has saved at least 7 pilots that I know of. The businessman beside Maria had abandoned any pretense of working. A flat spin is when the aircraft is spinning horizontally, right? Like a frisbee? Something like that, Maria acknowledged. In most fighter jets, it's recoverable. But the early F-22 prototypes had some unique characteristics. She's being modest, Wilson told the businessman. Before her maneuver, a flat spin in an F-22 was considered potentially unrecoverable. Most test pilots wouldn't even attempt it. But you did, Kelly said, looking at Maria with wide eyes. Maria shifted uncomfortably in her seat. How could she explain that moment? The terrifying silence as the prototype began to spin, systems failing, the ground rushing up. The clarity that had come over her, time seeming to slow as she worked through the problem, trying something no simulator had predicted would work. I had a job to do, she said simply. Find the aircraft's limits and then find ways to come back from them. Wilson nodded in understanding. The captain was wondering if you'd like to come up to the cockpit for a few minutes, give you a better view of your old friends out there. He gestured toward the F-22 still flying alongside them. Maria hesitated. Part of her wanted to refuse, to return to her book and her anonymity. But another part, a part she thought she'd locked away years ago, stirred at the thought of sitting in a cockpit again, even as a passenger. All right, she agreed finally. As she unbuckled her seatbelt, other passengers began to take notice. A murmur ran through the cabin as Wilson escorted her toward the front of the plane. Maria kept her eyes forward, ignoring the stares, though she couldn't help overhearing snippets of conversation. Test pilot program. Did he say she has a maneuver named after her? My brother's in the Air Force. I wonder if he knows. The cockpit door opened as they approached. Captain Reynolds, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair, half rose from his seat to greet her. Colonel Alvarez, welcome to the flight deck. Sorry about all the fuss back there, but when Tom here recognized your name, well, it's not every day we have aviation royalty on board. Maria winced at the description, but accepted his handshake. Please, just Maria is fine. The captain gestured to the jump seat behind him. Have a seat. We've got about 20 minutes before we start our descent into Reagan. Maria settled into the familiar confines of an airplane cockpit. It was different from a fighter jet, of course, more spacious, less aggressive in its design. But there was still something comforting about the rows of instruments, the gentle glow of the displays, the subtle vibration of the aircraft around her. Through the windshield, she could see the F-22s more clearly now. They had adjusted their position slightly, moving in front of the airliner where the pilots could maintain visual contact with the cockpit. They've been asking about you, Reynolds said, nodding toward the fighter jets. Lieutenant Rodriguez and Captain Chen, both of them seem pretty excited to be escorting you. They don't even know me, Maria protested. Wilson, standing behind the captain's seat, laughed. Are you kidding? You're practically required reading at the academy these days, especially after what happened over the Pacific. Maria's stomach tightened, so they knew about that too. She had hoped that mission would remain classified, buried in Pentagon files where it belonged. That information was supposed to be restricted, she said quietly. Reynolds exchanged a glance with his co-pilot. The details are still classified, Colonel. But the fact that you saved that squadron? That got out years ago. A crackle came over the radio, followed by a young voice. United 1782, this is Raptor 2-1, requesting permission to communicate with Colonel Alvarez if she's available. Reynolds looked to Maria. Raising an eyebrow in question, she nodded and he handed her a spare headset. Raptor 2-1, this is United 1782. Colonel Alvarez is with us in the cockpit. Go ahead, Reynolds replied. Maria adjusted the headset, feeling strangely nervous. This is Alvarez, she said, her voice slipping automatically into the clipped professional tone of her flying days. Colonel, Lieutenant Ana Rodriguez here. Just wanted to say it's an honor to fly with you today, ma'am. Your work on the Raptor program made these birds what they are. Maria watched the aircraft to the right dip its wings slightly. A pilot's salute. Thank you, Lieutenant. Looks like you're handling her well. Learn from the best, ma'am. We all study your flight data at Nellis. A second voice joined the conversation. Colonel Captain David Chen, Raptor 22. Is it true you took a prototype to Mach 2.5 during testing? The manuals say the maximum is Mach 2.25. Maria couldn't help but smile at the awe in the young pilot's voice. The manuals have built-in safety margins, Captain. But yes, we pushed the envelope during testing. That's what test pilots do. And the Pacific incident, ma'am. Is it true you... That's still classified, Captain, Maria interrupted gently. And best discussed on the ground, if at all? Yes, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am, Chen replied quickly. Reynolds, who had been listening to the exchange, shook his head in amazement. You've got quite the fan club, Colonel. Maria handed the headset back to him, suddenly tired. The weight of the past was pressing down on her again. All these years she had thought she'd moved on, had convinced herself that leaving that life behind was the right choice. Yet here she was, surrounded by reminders of who she had been, who, perhaps, she still was beneath the civilian clothes and quiet life. We should start our descent soon, Reynolds said, checking his instruments. I'd better get you back to your seat, Colonel. FAA regulations and all that. Maria nodded, grateful for the excuse to retreat. As Wilson escorted her back through the cabin, she was aware of the changed atmosphere. Passengers who had ignored her earlier now watched her pass with curious eyes. A few nodded respectfully. One older man wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap gave her a subtle salute. Back at row 12, Kelly practically bounced in her seat as Maria returned. Oh my God, this is so cool. What was it like up there? Could you see the fighter jets better? Did you talk to the pilots? Maria settled back into her window seat, buckling her seatbelt. Yes, I spoke with them briefly, she said, hoping her tone would discourage further questions. It didn't. What did they say? Do they know about your maneuver thing? This is like the most exciting flight ever. The businessman, too, was looking at her with renewed interest. I'd be curious to know more about your career, Colonel. My company might be interested in having someone with your expertise consult on some of our military contracts. Maria felt trapped, hemmed in by their expectations and curiosity. This was exactly why she had chosen a quiet life in Denver, far from bases and ceremonies and people who knew her name. The constant questions, the rehashing of old missions, the way people looked at her. Not as she was now, but as the legend they had built in their minds. I'm sorry, she said firmly, but I'd really prefer not to discuss it further right now. Something in her tone must have conveyed her seriousness, because both Kelly and the businessman backed off. Kelly put her headphones back on, though she still shot occasional glances at Maria. The businessman returned to his laptop, though Maria suspected he was Googling her name rather than working. Outside the window, the F-22s maintained their escort. Maria watched them, allowing herself a moment of appreciation for the aircraft she had helped shape. Whatever complications her career had brought, whatever memories still haunted her, she couldn't deny the pride she felt seeing those machines in flight. They were her legacy, in a way, her contribution to something larger than herself. The plane continued its descent toward Reagan National Airport, the sprawling landscape of Washington, D.C., coming into clearer view with each passing minute. Maria gazed out her window, trying to ignore the occasional glances from other passengers. The brief escape to the cockpit had stirred up a storm of emotions she wasn't fully prepared to face. Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Reynolds speaking. The intercom crackled to life again. We're beginning our final approach into Reagan National. We should be on the ground in about 15 minutes. Our F-22 friends will be accompanying us for a few more minutes before they peel off. Weather in D.C. is clear and 72 degrees. Local time is 2:45 p.m. The F-22s were still visible outside Maria's window, their sleek forms cutting through the sky with effortless precision. She watched them with a professional eye, appreciating the subtle adjustments the pilots made to maintain their position relative to the airliner. Diane appeared at the end of the row, catching Maria's attention with a small wave. "Colonel Alvarez?" "The captain was wondering if you'd be willing to move to a different seat for the remainder of the flight." Maria frowned. "Is there a problem?" "Not at all," Diane assured her. "We have a seat in row 8 that would give you a better view of the Raptors. The captain thought you might appreciate it, and—" She hesitated, lowering her voice. "The pilots have requested a visual confirmation of your presence." "Visual confirmation?" Maria repeated, surprised. "Why would they need that?" Diane shrugged slightly. "Military protocol, I assume. They mentioned something about positive ID for their mission report." Maria understood immediately. This wasn't a routine training exercise anymore. Someone higher up the chain of command had gotten word that she was on this flight and had turned it into an impromptu honor guard. The realization made her uncomfortable, but also touched something deep within her, a sense of belonging to a tradition that stretched beyond her personal feelings. "All right," she said, unbuckling her seatbelt. "Lead the way." Kelly looked disappointed as Maria gathered her things. "You're leaving?" "But I have so many more questions." "Maybe another time," Maria said kindly, though she doubted their paths would cross again. As she moved toward the front of the plane, following Diane, she felt the eyes of the other passengers on her. Word had spread throughout the cabin about who she was, or at least fragments of the story. She heard whispers as she passed, caught snippets of speculation about her career, her medals, the classified missions that had become the stuff of Air Force legend. Row 8 was on the right side of the aircraft, next to a larger window that offered an expansive view of the sky and the F-22s flying alongside them. An elderly couple had been seated there originally, but they had been moved to first class, Diane explained in a whisper as Maria settled into her new seat. "The captain will be making another announcement shortly," Diane added. "Is there anything you need, Colonel?" Maria shook her head, her attention already drawn to the fighter jets outside her window. From this angle she could see them more clearly, the distinctive profile of the air intakes, the carefully angled surfaces designed to minimize radar signature, the small American flags painted on their tails. Modern Raptors, not the prototypes she had flown, but still familiar, still hers, in a way that transcended the years and the distance she had put between herself and her former life. The intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds again. I'd like to take a moment to tell you more about our special guest today. Colonel Maria Alvarez served for 27 years in the United States Air Force, including 12 years as a test pilot and program director for the F-22 Raptor. She is one of the most decorated pilots in Air Force history and will be receiving the Distinguished Service Medal tomorrow at the Pentagon for her contributions to aviation and national security." Maria closed her eyes briefly, fighting a wave of embarrassment. She had never sought recognition, had never wanted to be singled out. The medal tomorrow was enough of a spotlight. This public announcement felt like an invasion of the privacy she had guarded so carefully. "Colonel Alvarez's work has saved countless lives and helped establish American air superiority for decades to come," Reynolds continued. "The pilots escorting us today specifically requested this assignment when they learned she would be on our flight. They've asked if she would acknowledge them with the traditional Valkyrie salute before they depart." A murmur of interest ran through the cabin. Most passengers wouldn't know what the Valkyrie salute was. It wasn't something civilians would recognize. But to pilots, especially fighter pilots, it carried special significance. Maria felt a lump forming in her throat. The Valkyrie salute. She hadn't performed it in years, hadn't even thought about it since her retirement. It was an unofficial tradition, a gesture passed down through generations of test pilots at Edwards. Acknowledgement of those who flew the most dangerous missions, who pushed the boundaries of what was possible in the air. Outside the window, the F-22 nearest to her moved slightly closer, the pilot clearly visible in the cockpit now. Even through the helmet and visor, Maria could sense their anticipation, their respect. The tradition called for her to respond. These young pilots had gone out of their way to honor her. Military courtesy demanded that she acknowledge them in return. Yet something held her back. The same reluctance that had made her consider skipping tomorrow's ceremony, that had kept her living quietly in Denver all these years. Why was it so hard to accept this recognition? She had earned it, had sacrificed for it. The scars on her back and legs hidden beneath her clothing were permanent reminders of the risks she had taken. The nightmares that still occasionally woke her in the middle of the night, the sensation of falling, of fire, of the desperate struggle to regain control of a failing aircraft. Those were the price she had paid for the advances she had helped achieve. "Colonel?" Diane's voice broke into her thoughts. "The pilots are waiting for your response." Maria looked up at the flight attendant, then back out the window. The F-22 pilot was watching her, waiting. Beyond the physical gesture, this was a moment of decision. Would she continue to hide from her past, or would she finally acknowledge it, accept it as part of who she was, who she would always be? Slowly, deliberately, Maria raised her right hand. She extended her thumb and little finger, while keeping the 3 middle fingers curled against her palm. The traditional fighter pilot's signal. Then she added the second part of the Valkyrie salute, a subtle rolling motion of the wrist followed by a sharp downward cut. To most observers, it would have looked like a simple wave, perhaps a thumbs up. But to the pilots watching, it carried deeper meaning. It was the acknowledgement from a test pilot to those who followed, a silent communication of shared danger, shared purpose, shared understanding of what it meant to push the limits of human and machine. The response was immediate. Both F-22s dipped their wings simultaneously, a graceful roll that acknowledged her salute. Then with perfect coordination they pulled up sharply, climbing away from the airliner in a near vertical ascent that showcased the Raptor's incredible thrust-to-weight ratio. The cabin erupted, in gasps and exclamations, as passengers pressed against windows to watch the fighters climb into the blue. It was a breathtaking display of aerial prowess, a demonstration meant specifically for her. Maria watched until the F-22s were mere specks against the sky, feeling a complex mix of emotions, pride, nostalgia, a bittersweet acknowledgement of the life she had left behind. The Valkyrie salute had reconnected her, however briefly, to the community she had once been part of, to the tradition she had helped shape. "That was amazing," said a voice beside her. A young boy, perhaps 10 years old, had moved into the aisle seat next to her, his face alight with excitement. "Are you really a fighter pilot?" "I was," Maria said, finding it easier now to acknowledge this truth. "A long time ago." "My dad says girls can't be fighter pilots," the boy said, his expression serious. Maria smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Your dad is wrong about that. There are many female fighter pilots now. Some of the best pilots I know are women." The boy considered this, then nodded solemnly. "I think I'd like to be a pilot when I grow up." "It's hard work," Maria told him. "You have to study a lot of math and science, and you have to be brave even when you're scared." "Were you ever scared?" the boy asked. Maria thought about the question. Once she would have denied it, would have maintained the stoic facade expected of military officers. But now, looking into this child's earnest face, she saw no reason for pretense. "Yes," she said honestly, "many times. Being brave isn't about not feeling fear. It's about doing what needs to be done even when you are afraid." The boy nodded again, absorbing this wisdom. "Thanks," he said, then returned to his own seat as the plane continued its descent. The wheels of the aircraft touched down on the runway at Reagan National, the slight bump and roar of the engines in reverse thrust signaling their arrival in Washington, D.C. Maria gazed out the window as the plane taxied toward the terminal, the familiar skyline bringing back memories of countless previous visits, though never quite like this one. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Reagan National Airport," Captain Reynolds announced. "Local time is 3:05 p.m., and the temperature is a pleasant 72 degrees. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we reach the gate, and the fasten seatbelt sign has been turned off." Maria noticed something odd as they approached the terminal. Instead of the usual ground crew waiting with their orange wands and safety vests, there appeared to be a small group of people in military uniforms standing in formation on the tarmac. "That's unusual," she murmured to herself, leaning closer to the window to get a better look. Diane paused in the aisle beside her. "The captain asked me to inform you that there will be some military personnel meeting the plane," she said quietly. "Apparently word of your presence on board reached some people at the Pentagon." Maria felt a flutter of apprehension. This was becoming much more than she had bargained for. She had expected to slip into Washington anonymously, check into her hotel, and mentally prepare herself for tomorrow's ceremony. Instead, her cover had been completely blown, and now it seemed the military was determined to treat her arrival like some sort of official event. "I didn't request any of this," she told Diane, unable to keep the note of frustration from her voice. "I understand," Diane said sympathetically. "But from what I gather, these people came of their own accord. The captain couldn't really turn them away." As the plane finally came to a stop at the gate, Captain Reynolds' voice returned once more. "Folks, we have a bit of a special situation today. There are military personnel waiting to greet Colonel Alvarez upon deplaning. We ask for your patience as we coordinate this. We'll begin regular deplaning shortly thereafter." A ripple of excited whispers spread through the cabin. Several passengers craned their necks, trying to catch a glimpse of Maria or the waiting military personnel. She sank lower in her seat, wishing she could disappear. This public recognition went against everything she had sought in her quiet retirement. The seatbelt sign dinged off and passengers began the usual routine of gathering belongings and standing in the aisles. But no one moved toward the exit. Instead, all eyes turned expectantly toward Maria. Captain Reynolds appeared from the cockpit, making his way down the aisle to her seat. "Colonel Alvarez," he said formally, "if you're ready, they're waiting for you." Maria took a deep breath and stood, gathering her small carry-on bag. "Thank you, Captain," she said, "and thank you for everything during the flight." "The honor was ours," Reynolds replied sincerely, offering his hand. As Maria shook it, she noticed his other hand held something out to her, a small brush and a compact mirror. "Thought you might want these," he said with a smile. "My wife always says a person should look their best when making an entrance." Despite her nerves, Maria smiled gratefully. She took a moment to brush her silver-streaked hair and check her appearance. The face that looked back at her from the small mirror was lined with age and experience, but her eyes still held the same determination they had decades ago when she first climbed into a fighter cockpit. Ready as she'd ever be, Maria followed the captain toward the front of the plane. As she passed through the rows, something unexpected happened. A passenger stood up, the middle-aged woman with the military bearing she had noticed earlier. The woman came to attention and offered a crisp salute. Then another passenger stood, an older man who had been quietly reading throughout the flight. He too came to attention, revealing his military training in his posture. One by one, passengers throughout the cabin stood, some clearly veterans who saluted, others simply standing in respect. Maria felt a lump forming in her throat. She hadn't expected this, hadn't wanted it, and yet she couldn't deny the power of the moment. These strangers, who hours ago had seen her as just another passenger, were acknowledging her service in a way that transcended words. At the front of the plane, Diane waited by the open door, her eyes shining with emotion. "It's been an honor having you on board, Colonel," she said warmly. Maria paused at the threshold, looking back at the rows of standing passengers. Swallowing her emotion, she straightened her shoulders and offered a formal salute in return, not just to the veterans among them, but to all who had shown her this unexpected respect. Then she turned and stepped through the door into the jetway. She wasn't prepared for what awaited her. Standing at rigid attention in the jetway were two pilots in full flight gear, their helmets tucked under their arms. Their name patches identified them as Leon Rodriguez and Captain Chen, the F-22 pilots who had escorted the plane. Behind them stood a small contingent of Air Force officers, including a brigadier general whose insignia gleamed under the fluorescent lights. "Colonel Alvarez," said the general, stepping forward with hand extended. "I'm General Howard. Welcome to Washington. When we heard you were arriving today, some of your admirers insisted on being here to greet you." Maria shook his hand, finding her voice with effort. "This really wasn't necessary, General." "With respect, ma'am, it absolutely was." Lieutenant Rodriguez spoke up, her eyes bright with admiration. Though her hair was tied back in a regulation bun and her face showed the weathering of high-altitude flying, Maria could tell she was quite young, probably no more than 30. "Your work on the Raptor program built the plane I fly today," Rodriguez continued. "The emergency protocols you developed saved my life during a systems failure over the Pacific last year." Captain Chen nodded in agreement. "Mine too, during a training exercise gone wrong." Your legacy lives in every F-22 cockpit, ma'am. Maria looked at these young pilots, the next generation who carried forward what she and her colleagues had begun. For the first time since receiving the invitation to tomorrow's ceremony, she felt a genuine sense of pride. Not pride in medals or recognition, but in the knowledge that her work had made a difference, had kept these young aviators safe as they defended their country. The Valkyrie salute, she said, glancing between them. You recognized it. Every test pilot knows it, Chen said with reverence. It's part of the heritage. General Howard cleared his throat. Colonel, we've arranged transportation to your hotel. And if you're amenable, there's a small reception this evening. Just a few people who wanted to pay their respects before tomorrow's formal ceremony. Maria hesitated, her instinct still to retreat, to maintain the privacy she had guarded so carefully. But something had shifted during this journey. The distance she had tried to maintain between her past and present was narrowing, the compartmentalization breaking down. Perhaps it was time to stop running, to embrace all the parts of herself, colonel and civilian, past and present. I'd be honored, General, she said finally. As they escorted her through the terminal toward the exit, Maria noticed people stopping to watch, some taking pictures, others pointing curiously. Word seemed to have spread somehow, perhaps through social media posts from passengers on the plane. The anonymity she had treasured was gone, at least for now. Outside, a black SUV with government plates waited. As General Howard opened the door for her, Maria paused to look back at the airport, thinking about the journey that had brought her here. Not just the flight from Denver, but the longer journey from young pilot to test program director to retired colonel. You know, she said thoughtfully to the young pilots who had escorted her, when I started flying, there were people who said women couldn't handle fighter jets, that our reflexes weren't fast enough, our judgment not sound enough for split-second decisions. Rodriguez smiled. I've heard those stories, ma'am. My class at the academy was nearly 30% women. 30%, Maria repeated, shaking her head in wonder. It was less than 5% in my day. You opened doors, Colonel, General Howard said quietly. More than you know. As Maria settled into the SUV, she thought about the ceremony tomorrow, the medal they would pin on her uniform, a uniform she hadn't worn in years but which still hung perfectly pressed in her closet. She had been dreading it, seeing it as a reminder of a life she had left behind. Now she understood it differently, not as a closing chapter but as a confirmation of a legacy that continued through the pilots who followed her, who studied her techniques, who flew safer because of her work. The SUV pulled away from the curb, heading toward the city. Maria watched the airport recede in the rear window, thinking of seat 12F and how her journey had unfolded. She had boarded the plane as Maria Alvarez, retired civilian trying to keep a low profile. She was leaving it as Colonel Alvarez, finally ready to embrace the recognition she had earned. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own emotions. But for now, she was content to have found a kind of peace with her past, to have reconnected with the community she had helped build, to have seen the impact of her work in the eyes of the young pilots who carried it forward. She was no longer just in seat 12F. She was exactly where she needed to be.